Well, thank you for being here. First, let me say thank you to our sponsors who've been faithful to the Savannah Council on World Affairs through this whole season of virtual and hybrid programs. Our platinum sponsor for all of 2021-22 has been Kreitz Auto Group, Savannah's dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz. Dale Kreitz Jr. seems to like what we're doing, and he continues to support us. In-kind sponsors for this season will also include the Planners Inn, Four Seasons Travel, and tonight our program sponsor is People's Community Bank. And they say they have the heart of a community bank and the talent, products, and services of a larger institution. So that sounds pretty good. I mean, if you have financial issues. So we're really lucky tonight. We have retired Ambassador Deborah Malac, who was born and raised here in Savannah. And when she went out of town, she really went out of town. Because most of her career has been focused on sub-Saharan Africa. And I confess to not knowing much about Africa, and I'm going to confess for many of you that there's also, it's not the place we study a lot every day, most of us. They barely get a section in The Economist magazine. From 2016 to 2020, she was our ambassador to Uganda. What we know about Uganda is just a lot of bad stories, I think, from way back when. And before that, she was an ambassador, our ambassador to Liberia. She's also served in Ethiopia, Senegal, got over to Thailand for a while, but then came back to South Africa and Cameroon. She retired from the Department of State 2 years ago, but she's still engaged in what goes on in that part of the world. She's on the board of an organization called NYACA Global. They work with communities in Africa to nurture and protect children so they can learn and grow and thrive. And she's also engaged with the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Foundation. Some of you may know of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She was the first democratically elected woman president in Africa. She led Liberia from 2006 to 2018. And 2011, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. So through you, we're touching a Nobel Peace Prize winner, which is pretty special. You know, Washington's always in the news, and there's a lot about what's our policy about this or that. Now that Larry's joined us, we've learned a little bit more about what goes on in our embassies. But you know, no matter what they dream up in the State Department or the White House, if it's not implemented on the ground by the people who are there to do the work, it really doesn't amount to it very much. And a lot of that work can be a grind, can be thankless, be unnoticed, certainly unnoticed by many of us back here. Failures, on the other hand, are quick to get a spotlight. Successes, not much news there. And nowhere probably have the victories and the small gains been as unnoticed as they might have been in Africa. 54 countries, an enormous mix of population, geographies, climates. Tonight, I hope Ambassador Malac will help us come to better understand what goes on in that embassy and why Africa matters to us. Ambassador.
Good evening, everyone. It's this is like I said that I know we're in a church, but it's like church. Everybody's sitting at the back of the room. Nobody wants to be on the front row. So, first, let me say thank you to the council for allowing me this opportunity. I'm always happy to have an excuse to come home to Savannah. I don't get back here as often as I would like. As you've heard, I was born and raised in Savannah. I left after college, and my dad, who was a longtime union camp employee, when he retired after 35 years, he hightailed it to the mountains and the forests. For a forester, makes sense, right? Couldn't stand the beach, wanted to be in the mountains. So they left not too many years after I left, and so I don't come home as often as I'd like. So it's nice to have a chance to be here and have spent a few days to go and visit some of my old haunts and reconnect with some friends that I have. And thank you all for taking an interest and coming this evening. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my biography, only in the sense that a lot of people always ask me how I ended up, somebody who came from Savannah, who doesn't fit the profile, certainly of your traditional diplomat of the 1980s when I joined the State Department, where it was very much male, white, and Ivy League. So I, obviously coming from Savannah, going to schools in the South, I graduated from Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, got a graduate degree from the University of Virginia. So not at all the path that many of my colleagues in the early days were taking. But the reason really was because my father was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia. He crawled out on his hands and knees under cover of darkness across the border from Czechoslovakia into Germany in 1949 in search of freedom, in search of democracy, in search of economic opportunity, because he knew that that was something he could find in the United States. And although he really loved his homeland, he was not prepared to live his life under communist rule. And so he came to the United States. He had met my mother, who was the daughter of missionaries in Czechoslovakia, so was American citizen, but grew up overseas. And eventually found their way to Savannah, working for Union Camp, spent 35 years here. But because they came into Savannah with a different background and a different perspective than many of the people I grew up with at the time, we had a very different perception in our household of the wider world. I mean, I had a lot of people that I grew up with who never even went to South Carolina, even though it was right across the river. They stayed very much at home. But I was always thinking about, if not just Europe and my dad's entire family that was still there, thinking about all the other wonderful and interesting places that I could possibly visit. And so that was part of what drove me in the direction of knowing that whatever I did with my life, doing something that allowed me to travel, if not live overseas, to learn other languages, to meet other cultures, was something that always intrigued me. So that even when I went off to college and thought I was going to be a biologist, and went off as a pre-med major to school, I ran into organic chemistry and decided I don't need to work this hard. What can I do instead? And so I switched my major to international affairs with a specialization in Eastern European and Soviet studies. Because of course, in the 1970s, that was the hot topic. We spent hours studying the Kremlin and who's on the stage and who's not on the stage and who's in and who's out. And if I wasn't going to be in the foreign, and if I was going to go do diplomatic work, I was going to go work in Eastern Europe. I was going to go visit all my family that I never got to see. Didn't quite work out that way. I joined the State Department, found myself there sort of serendipitously in this sort of second wave of women who joined the Foreign Service, because not too many years before I joined, They finally changed the rules, and if you were a female officer, you could get married and wouldn't have to resign. It was a pretty difficult time in those days. So the few women who had come in the very first wave were pretty much all single and did nothing but work all the time. We were sort of in the next group, and we stood on their shoulders, but we were a very small group, and we were surrounded by a lot of men who didn't think we should be there. So, not so unusual in the in the early 1980s or late 1970s. Was it people were wondering, what could women do, and why aren't you back home where you should be? So I spend a little bit of time on this just to help you understand where I was coming from and why, how I ended up doing what I did. But when I joined the Foreign Service, I thought, this is something I'll do for 5 or 6 years. I'll go travel around the world. I'll go someplace new that I've never been, thinking for me that would be some other part of Europe. The State Department had a different idea. They sent me to Africa. So my first assignment was in Cameroon, which is in Central Africa. And I have to say, I was smitten after that. For those of you who've never set foot on the continent, there is something about the quality of light, the sounds, the geography. It's very easy to get enraptured with the environment. And so if you haven't been, I urge you to find a place on the continent to go. But I went to Cameroon, and then I went to South Africa. And then I thought, well, I need to do something different. So I went to Southeast Asia for a few years, but then I came back. And over the course of the next 35 years, because I spent almost 39 years in the State Department, never dreaming that I would do that, or become an ambassador for that matter, I realized that in Africa, at least for the type of work that we do as diplomats, it was far more interesting than what you would do in Europe, where you basically were hosting visitors all the time when the congressman wanted to come and visit. And frankly, when we were in Thailand, it was the same thing. The congressional delegations came to visit and wanted to go shopping. So it was an opportunity to really make a difference, even in a small way, on a community level, in a relationship. But the heart and soul of what we do as diplomats really is building relationships and nurturing relationships and creating that environment where we can help others understand who we are as Americans, what it is we're trying to do, and also hopefully learn from others about what they're trying to accomplish. But at the heart of it is a relationship. And it's much easier to forge that relationship, I found, in the countries in Africa where I was privileged to serve. So that's kind of a long-winded way of explaining how I ended up where I was, where I have been for the last 39 years. But it's also afforded me the opportunity to do some things that I never would have imagined were possible. So I really want to talk a little bit now, just give three sort of little stories of things that I did during the course of my career. In the context of what happened, we'll talk a little bit about fighting disease, which is obviously a timely topic. A little bit about the work, the sort of more traditional nuts and bolts work that we as diplomats do to promote democracy and protection of human rights, gender equality, all of those sort of touchy-feely good things, American values that we're pushing. And then some of the work that we did, which was a very important work and work that I think we need to do much more of, which is working on behalf of U.S. private sector in Africa, where there are huge opportunities. And talk a little bit about, one of the big success stories that I was part of, which really helped seal the deal for a very large project for a U.S. company, a U.S. consortium. So obviously disease is on everybody's minds these days, 2.5 years into the COVID pandemic. But I was the ambassador in Liberia when Ebola struck in West Africa. So it was new, not the disease itself, but it had never been seen in West Africa before. And so there was no surveillance system set up, there was no testing, we knew about Ebola, but only because it had happened in small isolated villages in Central Africa previously. So when the first cases walked across the border into Liberia from Guinea in March of 2014, naturally everybody panicked because we just assumed everybody was going to die. You watch the Hollywood movies, you think, okay, what do we do now? How do you protect people? Because no cure, no vaccine, no treatment really other than supportive care for people who get sick. And up until that point, the mortality rate for this disease when it had showed up previously was anywhere between 85 and 100%. And so that's very hard when you're, particularly as an ambassador, where you have a responsibility for all the people that work for you, not just the Americans who work for you, but your local staff as well. What do you tell your folks that, their chances or their odds are no better than anybody else's in the country? If you get sick, we'll send you off to the Doctors Without Borders treatment center and you take your chances like everybody else, right? Because there really was no option. So it was a pretty scary concept at the, sort of looking at what we had to deal with. And in the first few months, we were collectively fairly successful in managing to keep the disease under control. There were cases, but it wasn't spreading as fast as people thought. And we even thought, as it went underground for a few months, that we had defeated it, and we didn't have to worry about it. And then 2 months later, it came roaring back in the city of Monrovia, which is a capital city of 1.2 million people at the time. Had never been seen in an urban area before. And suddenly you had cases like this because everybody lived on top of each other. And Ebola, unlike coronavirus, is not spread by air, but you have to be very up close and personal with people. And so when people died, they washed their bodies. When people died, they hugged the bodies, they kissed the bodies, and that's when they were most infectious. And so the disease would spread because people didn't want to believe it was real. So we had a huge task in front of us to mobilize messaging, to get accurate information out to people, to get the government of Liberia the resources that they needed. Ultimately, the President Obama at the time, mounted a huge response and mobilized other governments around the world to respond to the disease outbreak, not just in Liberia, but in Guinea and Sierra Leone as well. The US response was the largest inside Liberia, just given the historical relationship that we had. At one point, we had almost 3,000 US military men and women on the ground in Liberia to help us with logistics and planning. But it was a Herculean task. And we had a trial run, if you will, for the kinds of things that should happen in the face of a disease outbreak. But there was one very unique thing about all of this, is that the US government had never before responded with a crisis mobilization to a disease outbreak. We respond on a crisis basis to natural disasters. If there's an earthquake, if there's a war or a famine, we send in responders through USAID, through the military in some cases to provide airlift and deliver supplies, through CDC. But we had never done this before for a disease. And it took a lot of work to convince Washington that this was something that we needed to do, that we needed to not simply say, oh, well, the doctors can take care of it, or the nurses can take care of it, or you can send in CDC responders who are absolutely critical in helping to build capacity internally. But we have to think differently and figure out what we can do to respond, because the projections were that over 1 million people would die in the course of 3 months. if the disease continued to move at the rate that it was moving. So it took a lot of work. We had a great because we had a great relationship with the government of Liberia and President Sirleaf, who was president at the time. We were able, as the embassy, as the diplomats, to open doors for people, to get the people in front of the president to say, this is what you need to do, this can't happen, this is how you need to treat this, because there was no capacity locally. The US government had done a lot of good work in response to HIV, right? We had a presidential program called PEPFAR that had been working since since about 2006, started by the Bush administration, which had done a lot of work in some countries in Africa to build capacity to respond to disease and help strengthen health systems. But we weren't doing this across the continent, and the countries in West Africa were not PEPFAR countries. So all the investments in the health sector were only to deliver healthcare, basic primary healthcare, or maybe vaccinations, do maternal health, make sure that mothers could deliver babies safely. So what we had to also do at the same time was build the capacity internally to fight disease, to detect disease, to surveil for disease. And so, anyone will tell you that trying to do that in the midst of a crisis, the old adage of building the airplane while you're trying to fly it, is not the way you want to do things. And so we spent, there were a lot of resources expended trying to get that to happen and create capacity in Liberia. And I'm happy to say we were successful in doing that, and a lot of that same public health capacity that we created during the course of the Ebola epidemic continues today inside Liberia and has helped them in their fight against COVID, because it's the same kind of disease surveillance, response, detection mechanisms to make sure that when something is happening in part of the country that you wouldn't know about if you weren't collecting the information. But I think it's important to see that the technical piece is important. Having the technicians, the CDC epidemiologists, or having the doctors, or having logisticians who can help with lift and plan for making sure you have enough personal protective equipment to last throughout the epidemic. But what you also need is the diplomatic piece, because again, it comes back to this relationship building. Being able to have built up enough trust with the government, to build up enough trust with the individuals within the government that you have to work with, or your other partners, whether from the UN, from other governments, so that you can say, this will work, this won't work, here's what you can do, we can do this. And they know enough to know that what you're doing is coming to them honestly with information that will help solve the problem. Unfortunately, a lot of the lessons we should have learned from the fight against Ebola didn't necessarily continue, because the ultimate piece of this is ensuring that we can make continued investments and work with other governments to make continued investments to make sure that capacity to detect disease and respond to it exists in every country. Because if we have, you fast forward a few years, and what we've seen, obviously, with COVID, how quickly something that does spread via through the respiratory system can move very, very quickly, and having some countries able to respond and other countries not able to do so is not a good thing. But I guess the positive piece of this that I want to really highlight is that there is capacity in Africa. The countries across the continent, it's varying from country to country. And it's in everyone's interest to make sure that they continue to build that capacity, because we all depend on it globally. If we haven't learned anything, if the disease pops up in one place, it will be knocking on our door the next time we, before we know it. Then on the democracy promotion piece, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is really, as I said, the nuts and bolts of what we do in the Foreign Service as well. because that's why we have embassies overseas, to project our presence, to project our foreign policy, to set an example for people of what democracy looks like, what we should do, ensuring that governments are responsive to their citizens. Now, it's not a perfect scenario by any stretch of the imagination, but we also have a job to explain to the local, to the host nations, what we do in the United States, how our government works, what doesn't work, and to be very honest and open about what is working and what isn't. Now, in Uganda, I got off on the wrong foot with the government. I showed up 4 days before a national election, which is probably not something I would recommend to people who are getting ready to start a new assignment to do. But there was a reason for it, because I had a history working on East African issues previously. And so I knew I had watched elections in Uganda in earlier years and wanted to be on the ground to really see for myself what was happening. Went out to polling stations, watched what was happening. Because what happens frequently, unfortunately, not just in Uganda, but in many countries on the continent, is manipulation of the voting process, or manipulation of the counting process, or manipulation of the election rolls, or demonstrations and violence against political opposition. It can be a rather messy picture. And so the elections, not surprisingly, of the president who was being elected at that point to his 5th term in office, and has now been in office and was just recently reelected to his 6th term in office, was that, not surprisingly, the election was highly manipulated. And we, as the US government, were quite critical. I was very vocal about, both publicly and privately, about our concerns and what needed, what was problematic and how disappointed we were in the way the process had gone. And it made not just the president, but those around him very unhappy. And it took me many, many months to repair that relationship. But I'm happy to report, by the time I left, after 4 years, we had a perfectly cordial relationship. But it was important that the president knew that when I did meet with him, that I was going to be very honest with him and very candid, which is not always what people think of as what diplomats do, that we're supposed to have, sweet language and, not really tell people what they're doing wrong. But I'm here to tell you that more times than not, most diplomats, particularly most ambassadors, are very frank with their government representatives that they interact with, and tell things like they are. The problem is that there's a perception that just because we've gone in and banged on the table and said you shouldn't have done that or you should do this instead, that governments and individuals and presidents or prime ministers will automatically change their behavior. We all know human nature doesn't work that way. I think those of us who were diplomats would wish that it would work. So if we just said, oh, I delivered this démarche, I've told them that this is the problem, and then of course they're going to act a certain way. Doesn't happen. So it's work that has to continue on a daily basis. And again, it starts not just at the top with the ambassadors, but all of our staff are out talking to taxi drivers and traveling throughout the country and visiting with communities. In fact, as a political officer, when I was early on in my career, I used to love to get in a taxi and talk to the taxi driver, because they could tell you all kinds of stuff that was going on in the country that you wouldn't know about otherwise. They knew who was going where and just what the political sentiment was in a particular community. And that's some of the really interesting and interesting part of the work that we do. Done all this. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about private sector because I do want, and then I'm going to talk just a little bit about Africa in general, and then I'd rather take your questions because I think I can give you some, it'll be easier to understand where and what you might be interested in. But U.S., we believe as the U.S., as the United States, an element of U.S. foreign policy is that ultimately private sector growth is really the way to lead economic growth and development, right? It's been small and medium-sized businesses in particular in the U.S. have been the backbone of our economy forever. And we feel very strongly that that's what other countries, particularly countries in Africa that are on a path to economic development, can benefit most from. Unfortunately, many of the governments in Africa tend to have much more centrist or state-run economies. They're less, they have some space for private sector, but not nearly enough. And so you find different levels of openness to private sector activity. But the reality is that is where there really is the most potential. And there certainly are opportunities across the continent for U.S. private sector entities who are interested in making the commitment. It's not for the faint of heart. It's extremely difficult, even in some of the most robust economies, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, lots of challenges, corruption not the least of them, but just understanding the environment. And that's where embassies can be quite helpful because we know the environment, we know how to navigate, rather than being taken in by some consultant who may decide that they know best and get you wrapped up in some process with maybe nefarious people who say, oh yeah, you've got to talk to this person or you have to go and see this person in order to do it. I'm very proud of the fact that while I was in Uganda, worked on behalf of a small U.S. business development company that put together a consortium to bid on a $3.5 billion oil refinery project in Uganda. Started out with 8 different companies, and this small little US-led consortium ended up as one of the 2 finalists. And the other company was a Chinese company. So we spent weeks, I had multiple conversations on behalf of the company, with the company, with the president of Uganda, with the Minister of Energy. We were constantly back and forth. Lots of people behind the scenes trying to subvert the process, including outright payments being made to people in the Ugandan government by the Chinese company, not by the US company. But we landed the deal. And a lot of that came because of that personal effort that we put in on the part of the embassy to get that deal done. It's slowly wending its way forward, but we're particularly proud of the fact that we snatched it out from underneath the Chinese, who were not very happy about it. So just sort of 3 different examples of some of the work that we do, but they're all very indicative of some of the challenges and opportunities that you find across the continent. So one of the biggest thing we need to do as we look at Africa is really try to create a paradigm shift, not look at Africa as a place that is a prize to be won by the US or by the Chinese or by the Russians or by the Indians or the Turks, who are also moving in quite a big way into East Africa. We really have to, we need to sort of take a step back and try to reset that relationship and understand that the success of the countries, of those 54 different countries in the continent of Africa, all of whom may have some of the similar problems, or all have different histories and different cultures and different aspirations in some way, but they need to be integrated more fully into the global economy and into the global discussion on any issue, rather than lumped together as one country on a continent. And I think that's the challenge often for us in the US, because there's still this tendency to, you mention Africa and we talk about Africa. I mean, even if you look at the news, it's like, this happened in Africa as opposed to this happened in Rwanda or it happened in South Africa. We very rarely name the country that something has happened in. We talk about Africa, even still 60 years after independence for most of those countries. And that has to change. We have to be more cognizant that just like in Europe where you have different countries, just like in Asia where you have different countries, South America, we can't just assume that because they are geographically linked or geographically in proximity to one another that they're exactly the same, because they're not. I mean, Africa is this vast, rich tapestry of cultures and music and people and language and history that has influenced, even without us necessarily knowing it, has influenced even us here in the United States, partly through the history of slavery, with people coming over. I mean, there's a lot of relationships, but we have to get to this point where we understand that we treat them on an equal level, that we're no longer in this client-patron relationship, because otherwise we will never get out of this sort of 1960s mindset that Africa is a place to be saved or delivered or won as a prize, because there's a lot of talent there, there's a lot of energy there, and it will be, as many observers have written, the 21st century will be, to a certain extent, the African century, because their population, currently 1.3 billion people, in 30 years is projected to be 3.4 billion people. They will be a force to be reckoned with, and it's in our interest to find ways to support the aspirations of the overwhelmingly young population on the continent. Just in Uganda, the average Ugandan is a 14-year-old girl. Average. Continent-wide, I think it's around 16, I think, is the average age. It varies a little bit from country to country, but as a continent, it's a very young population. And there's more every year. And they need economic opportunity, they need jobs, they need education. And those the governments in many of these countries are not necessarily following policies that will create an economic environment that will provide that economic opportunity. So US investment can help. There's room for other countries to invest as well. And Africans themselves, across these different countries, need to invest in their own countries as well, because that's the challenge often. The money doesn't stay in the country. Even for the people who are well off in those particular countries, the money goes somewhere else. Even if it's going into their pocket, it's not being kept on the continent and reinvested in activities. It's ending up in a bank somewhere, or in yachts, I guess, as we're discovering now with all the Russian oligarchs, yachts and apartments and things that people are buying. So it's really trying to figure out how we can not present the solutions to the countries, but ask them what the solution is and figure out how we help them get there. Because too often we get caught up in this idea that somehow we are going to save them. We are going to deliver a better future. And it has to be a joint partnership. It has to be a real partnership. And identifying often what some of these young people need is just the opportunity. They already have the skill, or they have the education, or they have the idea, because there's a lot of innovation going on the continent that people don't even realize. We were talking earlier this evening about mobile money and how mobile money and mobile technology in general has really taken off in Africa, across the continent, and has really made a difference, even for the poorest of the poor market women in Liberia or in Kenya. They're connected to the financial system with their phone, and the mobile money that they can transfer, which 15 years ago was no one even imagined it was a possibility, because they're not going to go to a traditional bank because they don't have nearly enough money, but they can use that mobile money to get a small micro loan to invest in their business that then they can pay back, and generally they do. So it's finding those places in different countries where there have been successes, things that work, and blowing on them like a little spark to make that fire get bigger, because it's possible. And I've seen it. I've seen the incredible, intellectual power, the innovation, the energy, the passion, because at the end of the day, what every African in the different countries on the continent want is exactly what we all want, which is a better life for ourselves, a better life for our children, a roof over our heads, a job, enough food to eat. And so how we figure out how we help them do that in a way that makes sense in the countries and the environments that they live is really going to be the critical work that we do. I think I'm going to stop there and see what kinds of questions we might have. Are you going to moderate or or not?
We video this, but what I'm told is that if you will speak and project, we don't need to have you at a microphone to do it. So, first question.
Okay, probably some prejudice are going to come through the question, but I'm curious as to your ultimate reaction based on your perspective. My view is that China and India are two gigantic economies that are expanding both in terms of the economy and people, and they're trying to get everywhere in the world. Some of the biggest companies in the world are controlled by heads of states or heads of those organizations, rather, companies. And the U.S. is the third large group in that. So there's three groups. The fourth group I'll call private enterprise that may have a mind of its own. So you've got those four competing groups. What's your prognostication in terms of who's leading the charge and what we could do better that we're not doing now? Because I'll end on this. After we left Afghanistan, and Russia was there in military force, we were there in military force. China's not there in military force, but they're there, and they're taking over. And China doesn't go into places with the military. They go in with their bankers. So what's your prognostication?
Well, but I think you've sort of, it's this logical conclusion of what, we can say we want private sector development, we want countries to follow a certain path, but when there's economic opportunity, the Chinese go in and they do the work that needs to be done. They will go, and if they get a contract to build a road, if they need to bring in every single bulldozer because there isn't any equipment in the country, they will do that. Our private sector won't do that. Now, part of that is, of course, that it's not a level playing field because the Chinese government is subsidizing a lot of these private companies to go in and do that. So we can stand around and complain about the fact that the field isn't level and do what we can to try to level it. But in the meantime, we have to also figure out how we counteract that, which means that we need private sector companies that are willing to come in and understand that they're not going to make the profit in a year or 2 years or 3 years. They have to come and they have to invest in those relationships. Because at the end of the day, if you want to do private sector work, just like with true diplomatic work, you've got to have the relationships. Particularly in most African countries, it's all about who you know. And I don't necessarily mean who you know who's in a position of influence. They want to know who you are. They want to know who your family is. They want to sit and have a conversation about all of that before they get down to brass tacks and talk to you about what can we do and how do we do this work. And so there are 1,000 reasons why we just should say, well, we'll throw up our hands. And finally, across the continent of Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have 25 of the 27 poorest countries in the world on a per capita income basis, there is plenty of room for lots of activity. So, thinking that somehow we have to be the only actor, I think really is short-sighted. Ultimately, we have to figure out how we all work together and actually, and it goes back to this point, what is it the countries need? What is it the people say that they need? And how do we and others collaborate and cooperate and give them the tools to be able to do it?
You have a question back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Not a lot of people know that Savannah in Liberia has a historical connection. You may be familiar, you may or may not be familiar with Cornelius and Alice McCain. Their work in the 1890s, 1900s in establishing a hospital there. One of the first Americans to really work on building up Liberia in the time. My question is, not a lot of people know that, especially people my age. And you mentioned that the youth is where it's at in Africa, the largest, they share the largest demographic. So how can we make those connections with not just not just the youth in Africa, but the entire diaspora? You mentioned the impact of slavery, the diaspora, the African diaspora isn't affected. But how can we make those connections with not just our people in Africa, but in the Caribbean, in South America, and even in Europe?
Well, it's interesting that you raise this because the African diaspora is a hugely rich resource. And certainly governments in Africa are dying to figure out ways to create relationships with that broader African diaspora outside of the country. Not just in the sense of seeing if they can get remittances, but they want investment and they want to create those ties. And in some cases, Liberia and the Liberian diaspora, there's just by nature of 200 years of a relationship with the United States, there's a lot of back and forth. But not every country has that same kind of presence in the diaspora, either within the US or else globally. It varies. Ethiopia has a very active and large diaspora. South Africa, the Cape Verdeans, I think there's more Cape Verdeans who live in the United States than actually live in Cape Verde. So I think this is one of the ways it starts. Is better education in the United States about Africa. I mean, I can tell you when I was product of public schools in Chatham County. I'm pretty sure we spent maybe 5 minutes talking about Africa when I was in school, to be perfectly frank. And I will be the first to admit when I found out I was going to be assigned to Africa, I realized how much I did not know. I mean, I knew a lot less about, I knew a lot more about lots of other places in the world than I knew about Africa or Cameroon specifically. And so, it made me quite aware of the lack of education that we have in this country about Africa. We tend to be very Western civilization oriented in our history and social studies. And maybe in university, if you go to university, you'll get Asian history, or you have the opportunity to study about Africa. So that's one of the places that we have to do a better job is educating people. It gets back to my point earlier. Everybody, my kids were raised overseas, or spent a lot of their youth overseas, and they used to kill them when they would go to be back in the States and go to a social studies class. They'd come home and dinner table and tell me about somebody in my class stood up and said, "The country of Africa," and it was a personal affront to them that people didn't know, all the countries by name and the capitals. So I think that's one place that you start, is by making people aware of the fact that there is this history there is this culture there is this opportunity there, and there are lots of amazing people that we should know about and hear about and understand what's going on the continent. It's not a great answer, but I think that's, people have to educate themselves first, because it's hard to do anything else if you don't even know the problem is, you don't even know the extent of the issue.
Yes, sir, you had a question.
Over the past 10, 15 years,
Have you noticed any change in the American attitude towards Africa?
Yes, I mean, I would say over the 39, nearly 39 years since I first set foot on the continent, I mean, there's obviously been a change. But if it depends on if you talk about in the sense of U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. Yes, but that changes with every administration, right? It shifts a little bit. And emphasizing different aspects of it. If you're talking more globally, I think, yes, there has also been a shift that people start, because there is a more educated population, education levels, literacy levels across the continent are much higher than they were in 1960 in most places. Obviously, you have countries where literacy is still a challenge and you don't have You still need to do more in the education sector. And there has been, industrialization, been some improvement on economic growth and development. So people are more aware, partly because of the better communications. There's more information out there than there used to be 15 or 20 years ago. But I think generally there's still this perception that, it's a continent that's full of nothing but disease and poverty and crisis and conflict and war and famine. And unfortunately, a lot of that is still true. And I can tell you when I left Cameroon after having been there for 2 years and sort of looking at the time there, I was naive enough to think in 1983 when I left that, just imagine and look at all these incredible, hardworking people who just need, an opportunity to get the education they need, find the job they need, spoke multiple languages. It's like, the future is bright. These people will, it will be a march in the right direction. Sadly, it's been a step forward, a few steps back. As you look at different countries, I mean, some of the countries have had sort of a steady progress, but you look at something like Liberia, they had a 14-year civil war. I mean, there were challenges when the country was found in the first place, which sort of sowed the seeds of that civil war. But, they've been out of civil war now for about 15 years, and they've made progress, but it's, day to day. Literally hanging on because it's such a small country. There's all these other challenges that they have to confront. So I think in general, yes, but it's largely because people know more about it. But we still look at it through this lens of, extractive industries, they have the metals, what can we do? Or this savior complex, because these are poor people and we have to help them. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, but it's the old adage of, if you give a person a fish or teach them to fish, teaching them to fish is the better way to go forward so that they have the skills that they need to actually do for themselves as opposed to have to be dependent on us or others to do for them.
We want to honor your time, their time. No, we want to thank our government for changing their recruiting policy for the Foreign Service. Thank you, Madam Ambassador. Is that what you're called? Looks like Madam Secretary.
Yeah,
I like that.
Used to be.
Yeah. Okay, our next scheduled program had been coming up on May 5th, and it still is. And we have a French Brigadier General serving here in the U.S. Army. So he's going to explain to us what it's like to be a French Army officer in the United States Army, the 3rd ID, and what they're dealing with. And we have a special program lined up for actually the end of this month. We have a representative coming from the United Nations, International Labor Organization. And the topic is, I need to read it because I don't want to get it wrong. Because it is a topic that's captured the attention of boardrooms and consulting firms anyway, all around the world. And it has to do with women and gender equality in the workplace on a global basis. And we know the stories here, but there's a bigger story throughout the globe. So we're going to be hosting a speaker from the UN ILO to address that topic with us on April 28th. So once again, Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us. And we hope you enjoyed your time back in Savannah.
Of course, thank you.